Would you say that you're like top 1%, top 10%, top 0.1% of competitive programmers? Like, how good are you?
So that's an interesting question.
What's up, everybody? How's it going? Today, I'm joined by a very special guest. His name is David. He goes by Second Thread Online. He's actually got a really cool YouTube channel, which I'm going to link down below. He's actually a software engineer at Facebook and a really, really good competitive programmer. And we filmed a mock Google coding interview that I posted last week. Go check it out if you haven't already. The link will be in the description and comments down below. And today, we're going to be learning a little bit more about him, as well as about competitive programming. So David, first of all, how's it going? And why don't you tell us a little bit about, who you are, where you're from?
Good, it's going great. It was good to talk to you, Clement. So I grew up in Brookfield, Wisconsin. Then I went to college in Florida. And at the moment, I'm in Seattle, Washington, in the United States. And I work for Facebook, but everything I say here is just my personal opinion. I'm not speaking for the company or anything like that.
Totally get it. And you just graduated college recently?
I did, yeah. I went to the University of Central Florida, and I graduated there as a computer science major in the College of Engineering, I think.
Cool, very cool. And so obviously, the topic of the hour here is competitive programming. You are a competitive programmer. Why don't you start by telling us when you started competitive programming?
So I taught myself Java my freshman year of high school, just because I wanted to make a video game. So I think that's kind of what initially drove me to like programming, I guess. And then from there I competed in the Ludum Dare competition, which is just you just make a video game over a weekend, basically. That's it. But then one of my friends in high school invited me to go to a programming contest in Wisconsin. And in Wisconsin, they're very small. It's kind of a much newer thing. People aren't super into competitive programming there in general. So with just a little bit of practice over the next couple of years, we were able to win all of the competitions in Wisconsin my sophomore, junior, and senior year. And then I got a monitor and some other stuff as prizes. So that was kind of my first motivation into that. At the moment, I'm 22 and I just graduated college in 3 years. So I've been doing competitive programming I've been programming it all for about 6.5 years. And then I've been taking it pretty seriously for maybe 2 or 3 years.
Okay, wow. But it's really cool that you got a head start in high school and kind of just got pulled into it haphazardly, sort of.
Yeah, it was more just there was a competition that I've heard about. It wasn't really on a website or anything. And then I just started oh, that sounds cool. I had fun the first time I went, and then I practiced in order to do well the second time. And I had a team as well. So
Right.
Those were teams of 4 people with 2 computers, which is a different format than usual. Usually it's either 3 people, 1 computer, or just solo or something like that.
Gotcha. And so I guess help us non-competitive programmers understand how good you are. Would you say, and I know that this is kind of a weird question because you probably want to be humble, not arrogant, but don't worry, you can speak freely here. We won't judge you. Would you say that you're top 1%, top 10%, top 0.1%, 20% of competitive programmers? How good are you?
So that's an interesting question. If you're doing percentage-wise, it's tricky because it depends quite a bit on the denominator. So it depends how big of a group you want. If you pick everybody in the world, I'm a very, very slim percentage of the top, right? Because most people in the world don't program, right? But as you keep picking a bigger and bigger or a smaller and smaller group of people that you're looking at, I guess I drop a little bit. But I guess just to give a number. So in Google Code Jam, which is a pretty big competition, there were 40,000 people in the qualification round. And then I got 64th place when it finally ended. So 64th out of 40,000. So it's about top 0.1%-ish. It depends on that. On Codeforces, I'm 15th in the United States. So Codeforces is a really common competitive programming website. And I think that's probably the best used rating system or most commonly accepted rating system for how good 2 people are relative to each other. So I'm 15th in the US for that and about 500th in the world. And there are about I think 200,000 accounts on the website in total. So if that gives you a good sense, I think that might be helpful.
Yeah, that definitely gives a good sense. And I mean, that's pretty impressive, first of all. So congratulations. I mean, to be able to say effectively based on that Google Code Jam competition that you are, in the top 0.1% at something is obviously awesome. So congratulations on that. I guess 2 questions that come to mind here. The first one is, I've heard about this in other activities like chess, where like the skill differential between the best player in the world and let's say the 50th best player in the world is gigantic. So I'm curious, like for you who was 64th in Google Code Jam versus let's say number one, do you feel like the difference is just gigantic? Like you need so much more practice or something? Or would you say that it's really like at that point it's just you're very close to being number one? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, no, it's a good question for sure. And I think like if you just look at my absolute percentage, it looks like I'm almost as good as the best person, right? Like 0.1% and 0.001%, they're pretty close numbers. They're both pretty close to zero. But if you were to take me and I guess like Gennady Garakovich, he goes by Tourist usually. If you take me and Tourist and you compare us 1v1, if Tourist plays me 100 times, chances are either 99 out of 100 or 100 out of 100, maybe even more likely he beats me. So even though I'm like very close to him, like in the grand scheme of things, when it comes to it, just like chess, there's a huge difference between the best person and even like the fifth best person. Like chances are the best person is going to beat the fifth best person very often, which is, I guess, surprising because there's quite a bit of like randomness to it. Like different people are better at different questions, so you might expect it to be more varied than it is. But yeah, it's like kind of surprising how predictable. And this one guy named Tourist, he's been on the top of the scoreboard for years now. He's won like 7 or 8 Google Code Jam contests in a row. He's gotten first place 7 or 8 years in a row, which is just insane. But also there are lots of other really good people who I'm sure are much, much better than me. And also there are lots of people who are trying to become as good as me. So it's a very, very spread out field, I'd say for sure.
Yeah. But okay, that's super interesting. And I guess this leads me into that second question that I hinted at, which is how often do you practice competitive programming? Is this like any other skill, like let's say a sport or chess, where you basically have to practice, daily or almost daily if you want to be one of the best in the world? Or is this something that comes like really naturally to you and that you only do kind of as a side hobby every now and then?
Yeah, so it like kind of depends how much free time you have. If you're just trying to get into it, you don't need to spend like all day, every day practicing. Like it's definitely okay to spend maybe 6 or 7 hours a week, maybe if you can find that time practicing, and that's fine. But for me, like quite a bit of the time that I spent practicing was when I was in college. And the University of Central Florida, for school-related reasons, I wouldn't say is a hard college by any means. Like getting a degree there is not a hard thing to do. You don't need to be like really smart in order to do that. But the benefit of that, I guess, is that I got to spend almost all of my time training to be really good at competitive programming. So in college, I spent, I don't know, probably 40 or 45 hours a week training to get good at competitive programming. But since then, like now, I guess I have a job. I work full time. So I spend less than that. But still on weekends, I usually do a 5-hour contest every Saturday. And then I do 2 or 3 like 3-hour Code Forces contests across the week. So probably I spend maybe 15 to 20 hours a week practicing now still. But yeah, I know there are probably people who practice a lot more than me, but you definitely don't need to practice that much. So if you're really smart, you can get by with practicing less, or if you're really focused in how much you practice. And ultimately, it's a matter of just, there are certain things that you need to be exposed to, kind of like any skill. So once you've learned them and like once you're kind of good with them, then you can solve problems that use that skill. But if you haven't seen it before, in order to invent that yourself and come up with it from the first time from scratch, you just have to be so much smarter than everyone else that it's not really something that you can expect someone to do in that short of amount of time that you have of a contest.
Right. That makes sense. But it still is pretty impressive, or I guess like a testament to the amount of work that you put in, that you do put in, let's say 10 to 20 hours a week, even to this day. Like it does go to show you that like, it's not like you just jump into a contest and ace it. You still have to get that exposure, like you said.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm no genius here. I'm not just like some crazy smart person that picked up a keyboard and knew how to do this. Like it's definitely, to some degree, a function of the amount of time you practice. If you look at anyone who's like better than me, all of them have put thousands of hours of practice in. They've solved hundreds of problems. So you can't get good without practicing. That's kind of the sine qua non.
Totally. So you mentioned that you have a full-time job now, which is definitely taking up a large portion of your time. So let's talk a little bit about that. So as most of my viewers know, if you want to get into a company like Facebook or Google, any big tech company or startup, you have to pass the notorious coding interviews. And coding interviews are kind of similar to competitive programming problems. In some sense, they're like easier versions of competitive programming problems that test maybe slightly different skills. So I'm curious, as someone who clearly passed coding interviews at a big tech company like Facebook, did your competitive programming skills help you a lot?
Yeah, so I guess that's kind of maybe like the one interesting thing I have to say about competitive programming, which is companies at the moment probably value how good you are as a competitive programmer more than they should.
Okay.
Your ability to do well in these coding interviews is until you get to a certain level, at least, it's like almost directly correlated with how good you are at competitive programming, because they're almost the same thing. Like my first interview question that I got from Microsoft when I was applying to Microsoft for a summer internship was basically just find the top sort of a tree. And that's a really common thing to do in competitive programming. If you're a competitive programmer, you should know how to do that. Like that's just like a common skill.
Right.
Whereas like if you've never seen that before, that might be a really scary thing to be asked to do on the spot. So like it definitely helps in that regard. I guess once you hit a certain point, kind of with anything, it's like there's a diminishing return. So at this point, the algorithms and tricks that I'm learning are never going to show up on a coding interview, because if I tried to explain them to the interviewer, I would have a hard time explaining some of them in some 45-minute block, just because the tricks, like it takes me 2 weeks to learn. I wouldn't be able to teach it in 45 minutes. So like it gets to a point where maybe it's not helpful anymore. But yeah, like to a large degree, for the coding part, being good at competitive programming is super important, and I'd say like not essential, but very, very important in order to stand out from everyone else.
Right. The only caveat, I think, which is something that I always highlight, for instance, on my company, Algo Expert. By the way, if you're preparing for coding interviews, check out my company, Algo Expert. Go to algoexpert.io and use the promo code CLEM, CLEM, for a discount on the platform. But so, sorry for that plug, David. I just had to. But
No,
I always emphasize the fact that you have to be also a really good communicator, and you also have to have very good coding skills in a coding interview. And these are two things that you might not necessarily practice as much in competitive programming. The communication, because when you're doing a competitive programming contest, you're not actually talking to anybody. But then the coding skill aspect, because, and correct me if I'm wrong there, in competitive programming, no one's actually reading your code, right? You're just submitting it to a machine. Whereas in coding interviews, someone is reading your code, and they're explicitly looking out for readability in your code, cleanliness, best practices. So maybe you don't necessarily practice those skills in competitive programming.
Yeah, it's certainly not the end-all be-all. So the behavioral stuff you mentioned is super important. There are a lot of people I know that are really, really smart, but they're not super talented at explaining things. And that's fine. Like if your goal is to be really good at competitive programming, that's great. Like all that matters is how fast you can do this stuff. So it doesn't matter if you're not explaining it to anyone and it's a single person contest, then you're set. But when you're working in a large company, that's you have to be able to communicate with people. So that's an important skill to have, and that's like a good reason that they test for it. And then as far as code readability, in these programming contests, the goal is to write code that works on every case as fast as possible. And a side effect of that is that your code is pretty hard for someone else to understand. But if you're working for like a real company, it doesn't do the company any good for them to have a bunch of garbage code that works now. But if anybody else tries to come to the company to change it, they're not going to be able to figure out what you were thinking, what was going through your head at the moment. So yeah, so that's it doesn't quite match, which means like in coding interviews, you want to do stuff that's understandable and that the interviewer can understand. It doesn't exactly matter whether your code works perfectly. It should, obviously, and that matters in the real world, of course, as well. But you also want to make sure that it's something where the ideas aren't only inside your head, where they're also easy for other people to understand.
Right, exactly. And we're about to jump into how competitive programming spills over into real software engineering. But the last question I wanted to ask about coding interviews is a typical coding interview question that you might get at a company like Facebook or Google, is that trivial to you from an algorithmic point of view? as someone who's as good at competitive programming as you are?
So I don't want to say that, like, I certainly don't want to go into an interview with the mindset of it's going to be trivial, because that's kind of maybe setting myself up for failure. But in practice, for me, the hardest part by far was getting the interview. Once I was actually at the interview, for me, it wasn't really an issue as far as like getting through it, because most of the questions were either just easier versions of problems that I've seen by doing competitive programming, or things that I could work my way through pretty quickly with not too much help from the interviewer. But like, even if you are really good at these programming questions, there's still lots of other things that can go wrong. Like, it's possible you and your interviewer are on the same page when you explain something. So you have to make sure that when you explain something, you do a good job making yourself being able to be understood. And then also, like, there's the behavioral stuff, of course, which is a little bit of a dice roll, right? Like, maybe the person likes you, maybe they don't. But you want to make sure that you're not being like too antagonistic or anything like that. You want to make sure that you show the interviewer that you guys are working together and that you're trying to solve the problem, and you want them to understand how you're doing it. So, like, it's the problems themselves, for the most part, are pretty easy. Yeah. So I don't think, in general, for all of the problems that I've seen, they weren't, like, I wasn't worried about getting the right answer. But the behavioral stuff is, you have to be careful. You don't want to assume that you know everything and then get something wrong, because then you look really bad.
So all in all, it sounds like competitive programming gave you a bit of an advantage in the algorithmic side of things, the problems themselves, but obviously, like you said, there's a lot more to it. Now, I guess going back to the software engineering job, like what you're doing now full time, is there carryover there from competitive programming? Do you feel like your skill set that you have from competitive programming, and here let's put aside maybe just like, intellectual ability or problem-solving ability. I'm talking about really, tangible competitive programming skills. Do those have any carryover to your day-to-day job as a software engineer?
Interesting question. So, yeah, the problem-solving one, of course, I could explain that, but I think people already know that if you're a good problem solver, you'll be good at other things in life. There are a couple things where maybe, like, it is actually helpful, and you might not see that initially. I guess the first one is being able to debug things quickly. So in the real world, if you're writing code, it's only a matter of time before you break something badly. And you want to be able to figure out what the heck you're doing wrong as fast as possible before thousands of people say, hey, this important service is broken. So being able to do that is something that's really important in competitive programming. Be able to say, okay, I have a break case. I need to find out why my code doesn't do what I want it to do as fast as possible. You do the exact same thing on the job as soon as you break something badly that you weren't supposed to. So I guess in that's a very similar skill that shows up a lot. The particular algorithms that I use almost never show up in the real world. So being really good at some of these algorithms, they just don't, like, no one's going to ask you to write a balanced binary search tree, because if you're writing your own balanced binary search tree for a big company, you're doing something wrong. Someone else has already devoted days to do that in the most efficient possible way. You're not going to be able to beat them. So you should just use their code for that. So the strategy and the idea of like prioritizing what you want to spend your time on and being able to debug stuff really quickly and think about problems in like a modular way, that's helpful. But the actual like what you do in a programming contest compared to what you do when you're working on a job are to some degree kind of disjoint, I'd say. So the things you're actually doing are very different.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think like for the algorithms part that you just mentioned, that's where we can maybe get into the whole topic of problem solving ability, just being a competent person, but that I think, like you said, most people kind of realize that. I guess my final question touches on both competitive programming and software engineering. And specifically, I'm very curious, what do you find the most fun in both of these fields? What do you find the most rewarding in both of these fields? And maybe if you had to pick one, which would you say you prefer?
Ooh, all right, good questions. So I think I have like two different things that I enjoy about each of them. So for just the software engineering part, I really like the idea of making stuff. So I first joined because I first started programming because I liked the idea of making a game. And I like having something that like didn't used to exist and now it exists and I'm the reason that it exists. So both like electronic things, which are, I guess, maybe easier to make, and also like physical skateboards and electronics and stuff like that. I think they're fun to make because you do some work and then afterwards you've got some cool thing to show for it. So that's the part I most like about software engineering. For competitive programming, this is going to sound kind of silly, but the part that I find most rewarding is when you spend a lot of time working on some product, some problem that's like challenging and stuff, and then finally you get the green check mark, the green AC. Just getting that check mark saying you've done it, you've completed this challenge, good job. That's the part that I enjoy the most. Like getting the green check mark, I think, is the highlight of that.
I totally get it. I mean, I think there's probably an aspect there of like kind of not an addiction, but like it's kind of like a dopamine hit, right? You get this rush
For sure.
when you finally get it. I remember, even though I've never done competitive programming, I remember when I got into programming, I was introduced to it through these algorithmic type of problems, and it was so, addicting, for lack of a better word, to do these problems, press the run code button and see them all pass, or see all the test cases pass. So I totally can relate there.
And then also, like, when you get to a slightly higher level of it, it's very puzzle focused. So a lot of the problems aren't just write code that does this. It's like solve this interesting puzzle. And it's kind of like, you may have heard these logic challenges, which is like, okay, if this thing happens, find some way with the prisoners and the hats to do this or whatever. It's like that, except kind of maybe on steroids a little bit. It's like a more extreme version of that. So for whatever, I mean, I hopefully as the viewer, you think those are fun. If you think those are fun, whatever makes those fun is also, I think, kind of what makes the process towards getting the accepted fun for competitive programming as well. You also asked if I had to pick, which one would I choose? And that's a pretty tough question. So obviously, you can, at the moment at least, you can earn quite a bit more money by developing real products that actual people use. So in that sense, like what I currently do is my current priority is doing a good job to do what I'm paid to do where I work. But if like I got to choose whatever and I could just spend free time doing whatever, I do kind of enjoy the process of solving problems and solving these puzzles more if everything paid the same. And then also at the same time, I kind of work on the group of people that helps write problems for Facebook Hacker Cup. So I'm really lucky that I'm in a position where I kind of get to do both a little bit. Now, that's not what my official job is. I have like other responsibilities as well, but on my free time, I get to do that, which is fun.
Yeah, that's an awesome kind of perk to be able to do that. I remember when I was getting ready for my first job at Google, I had this thing where I was like, I really enjoy these algorithm problems and these puzzles, but from everything that everyone's telling me, on the job, that's just not what you do. And I was kind of like sad. And, ironically now I run a company where a large part of my job is to kind of work on algo problems. So I've been able to have that a little bit. But yeah, I totally get what you're saying. With that, David, I think this covers all of the questions that I wanted to ask you. Do you have any last words that you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, thank you, Clement. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. I really enjoyed it, and thank you for having me on your channel. And hopefully we're about to record the coding interview now, so hopefully that goes well as well.
Yes, we are. And if you are watching this video right now, I will likely have posted that coding interview before this video, but know that we're about to film it. So maybe David's a little bit stressed right now, a little bit nervous.
Yeah, it's always, like, showing up to an interview is always a little nerve-wracking, right? Because there's always the non-zero chance that you do something, like, terribly wrong. But hopefully I'll do my best to keep my nerves under control and do a good job on the interview, so.
I'm sure you're going to do well. And yes, thank you for being here, David. Like I said, I'll put the link to his channel in the description and in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter if you enjoy short-form written content, Instagram for pictures, and otherwise, I will see you in the next video.